Being a freshman at SUNY New Paltz was a great experience. My freshman year, I didn't know what I wanted to major in yet, so I was sort of all over the place in terms of classes. I ended up doing okay in terms of grades for that first year, but I was overall optimistic about how it would go in the future. That was all until the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Once I had to start doing school stuff at home, it was really difficult for me. I've known I was autistic ever since I was 3.5 years old, but it wasn't till after the COVID-19 pandemic that I was diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety, like generalized anxiety disorder. So that explains some things. Trying to complete schoolwork when not in a classroom environment was very difficult for me. At first, I was just missing 1 or 2 assignments a week, and then it just snowballed from there. Before I knew it, my grades were in the toilet. I nearly failed that semester if my parents hadn't found out in time. So when lockdown first started, I was living at my dad's house in Peekskill. One of these days where I was just mindlessly scrolling through the internet as a way to relieve some of my stress, I decided to do what I think a lot of us do in our spare time, one way or another. I searched up my own name. After a few pages in Google, because I went past the first page of Google, I found something that really unsettled me. It was a website called findagrave.com, and it had a page for my name. When I saw this gravestone with my own name on it, someone who died like 60-something years ago, I decided to call my grandfather about it. He told me that was his grandfather. My grandfather's grandfather had the same name as me. He was born in Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, which is a small country in Eastern Europe, I think right around Poland or Russia. My grandfather found a bunch of documentation about his old family. I think it was in the basement or something. He gave a bunch of scanned things to me in a flash drive, and one of them was the original Jacob Contius's passport. It's the last surviving photo that any of us have of him. I took it upon myself to enhance the photo and colorize it to see what he might have looked like when he was alive. With my freshman year, I got a taste of independence, and being brought back home and nearly failing a semester of college, I started to question, could I really make it? As an adult. I've heard so many horror stories about people with my diagnosis ending up staying at home for the rest of their lives. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, it's just that I hope for a future for myself where I can eventually live on my own or start my own life. The one skill that I knew that I needed to make it as an independent adult was use of public transportation. I resolved to take public transportation, like buses and trains, to try to see my great-great-grandfather's tombstone in person. I managed to find a route that I thought would allow me to leave early in the morning, go to the grave, have 2 hours to film it or whatever I wanted to do, and then come back before lunch. And I thought, what could possibly go wrong, right? The thing was, I didn't know if my parents would approve of me going on this expedition. I resolved not to tell them where I was going exactly until after the fact. I still wanted to make sure that someone knew that I was no longer in Peekskill. So I sent a text message to my dad the morning of, saying that I was going on a journey and I would be back that day. And I hoped that would be enough to keep me safe as a safety net. I packed all my stuff, my snacks, my filming equipment. I put it in a big backpack, and I walked out the door. I was planning on getting my tickets at each station. So in any case, when I got to New York Penn Station, my dad sent me a text back. When he saw my message, he said, "Hey, Jacob, what sort of journey you got on here?" And I knew I couldn't backtrack and say that I was just back at the house because he has a tracking app on my phone. So he knew where I was. So I told him what was going on. I told him that I was going to New Jersey by myself. And after everything that had happened with me lying about my grades and being afraid to ask for help during school, I was worried that he was going to be furious with me. But like, I didn't want to let that stop me, and like my heart was beating out of my chest. But I just let my stubbornness like carry me through and be like, well, I've already gone this far. I've already paid the tickets. So, but to my surprise, my dad just checked to make sure that I'd brought food and was prepared to go. And he said, go for it. Just make sure you get home safe. And I was like, I think that was the motivation that I needed to keep going, even though I was scared. The first roadblock I hit was trying to figure out how to get from New York to New Jersey. So when I arrived at New York Penn Station, all the ticket machines were broken. I decided to order them through a phone call, which I figured would be easy since I knew the people at the ticket station were available. So I just picked up the phone, and I was confused when I didn't see the woman behind the counter pick up the phone, and I instead heard a different voice. It wasn't a human woman. It was an automated, pre-programmed voice. The process of ordering the tickets was long, and I was worried that I would be missing the train before even getting the tickets. Finally, I got my ticket to go to New Jersey. So when I finally managed to figure out how to exit Newark Penn Station, I saw that there was a line of cabs there. So I went up to one of the cabs and I knocked on the window, and I asked if the cab driver knew the way to the North Arlington Jewish Cemetery. And he was like, what? And I was like, the cemetery in North Arlington? And he was like, I don't know any cemeteries in North Arlington. And I was like, okay, I'll just plug it into my map and show you where to go. And he was like, all right, fine with me. We ended up going back and forth along a few different roads, down a couple corners. And I was starting to think that both the driver and I were both lost. Finally, we found what looked like an entrance to a graveyard, and he was like, oh, thank God. So he drove up to the gate, let me off, and he said, if you need someone to pick you up, just call this number. And he gave me his number, and I was like, oh, thank goodness. So I didn't have to try to figure out a way back. Once he dropped me off, I went through the gate, and I saw that this graveyard was huge. So when I was there in person at what I thought was the same place, it didn't sit right with me. I was like, something's wrong here. So I start walking along, and this place is huge. It just keeps going and going. I walked for half an hour, and finally I ran into a couple that was walking in the opposite direction, and I was like, hey, is this the North Arlington Jewish Cemetery? And they were like, oh, no, this is a completely different place. And I was like, how many cemeteries are there around here? And they said, oh, 3. There's 3 of them within a block of each other. I'm just walking up and down the street trying to ask random people if they knew where this graveyard was. And most people don't regularly visit graveyards. So, and the graveyard I was trying to find was really small. So there's a relatively small Jewish community in this part of New Jersey. So it wasn't exactly the most popular one. So people kept directing me to the wrong graveyard. I'd gotten myself completely lost, despite the fact that I was holding a global positioning system map in my hand. So finally, I managed to find someone who was an elderly gentleman in the parking lot of this apartment complex. And it took me a while just to get to trust him. I asked him a few times about the directions. But eventually, he did convince me that, yes, he knew where he was talking about. He gave me clear directions. So finally, after talking to the elderly gentleman, I followed his instructions. I went out back. I finally found this little sliver of a wedge of grass with fence that didn't meet the corner, so there was a gap you could just walk in. It was by not only a construction site, but also a garbage dump. And I was like, this is the place. So I walked through the gaping gap in the fence on this wedge of grass. I walk forward, and after all this time, after finally finding the right graveyard, I immediately spot it. Right, just a few yards away from me is a gravestone with a name that I know better than anyone else's. Jacob Contius. I'd finally done it. I was so ecstatic, but at this point, I'd already spent so much time walking up and down streets being lost that I was like, okay, I'm just gonna take a few photos, and that's it, I'm done. That was the point where I found out that my ride back, the number that the cab driver gave me was out of service. That was the point where I basically went into panic mode. I started searching up like any taxis that were in the area. Each one that I called, they all said that all of their drivers were too far away from where I was. And they didn't even know the name of the place that I was talking about. I started to doubt if this whole thing was just a waste of time or like a terrible idea, but I did not want to give up on this. So I called the train station back up to see if I could reschedule my ticket, and it turns out I could. I found out online that I can reschedule my ticket. The problem was they put me on hold for 40 minutes. So I finally managed to talk with a real person. They rescheduled my train to later. Now that I had my train rescheduled, I realized I had way more time than I did before. So it gave me an opportunity to film some videos. I ended up getting so wrapped up in the filming process that I nearly missed the bus that I was planning on taking to go back to the train station. I just packed up my stuff really quickly and I just booked it. I just ran down that street as fast as my legs would take me. I get on the bus, I hand the bus driver some quarters and I go, he's like, is this enough? And he goes, no, you have to have like exact change. And I was like, I don't know how this works, I'm in a hurry. And he was like, is this your first time taking the bus by yourself? And I was like, yeah. Thankfully, the bus driver was very patient with me. He completely understood that like I was just a college kid. I don't know if he knew that I was in college. I think he might have thought that I was younger than I am. But in this case, that worked out in my favor. I think we ended up running into, I think, every red light on the way there. And I was just shaking because I knew the train would be arriving at 3:03. And if we did not get there within a minute or two, like, I didn't know what would happen. Finally, the bus arrives and I just tear out of that vehicle, like hoping as hard as I could that I managed to remember like everything and I didn't leave anything behind because I was not going back for anything. I ran past the doors, like down the stairs, through it to the gate, or through to the track, and I managed to arrive at 3:02. I had a minute to spare, but I'd made it. From there, it was smooth sailing. It's like I knew the route now, and I managed to finally get back home at just 6 p.m. I woke up at 6 a.m. that morning, arrived 6 p.m. that night. I'd spent 12 hours on this journey, but I'd finally made it. But I was very sweaty. And I just, like after all that, I just had to lie down and collapse. I think this experience was definitely inspirational for me. I think it helped me to regain like confidence in my capabilities. The experience of seeing the gravestone in person felt bizarre. It was like stepping into a Twilight Zone episode, but I think that's what made it so fascinating for me. Seeing a potential future for me, but also being able to see a part of my family's history and its past. As an update, now that my dad and stepmom have moved to Spokane officially, over the summer I took a plane by myself for the first time to visit them. So I still haven't gotten my driver's license, but that's a work in progress. But I'm taking the steps, and soon I'll be the next Jacob Concius.